going from the large room to essentially, like a cell, a small room that was, pretty identical, single hanging lamp. It was all concrete. It was very dirty. There were like roaches and shit like running around and everything. You can go ahead and pull up the next image, So, and then essentially this one, this was probably all the parts are like rough, but this is probably like the roughest part of the memory for me, just because it really was just essentially I had been placed in a room in this, this cell with another cage that was identical to my own, that was essentially had like a little rotting corpse in it. It was a little dead kid, and they looked really emaciated. Like they had like they had starved to death, basically. It was a little African American child, and it was just, the smell of like rotting flesh in the room was overwhelming, and it was just dealing with I've always been a very empathetic person, so you're dealing with all like the fear, of yourself being in that position, of being essentially like left in this cage in a room to die, and that's just kind of what's constantly going on in your head, is like that fear. But then also you're going to have a lot of empathy, because it was just feeling sad knowing that had happened, to that kid, that for me was really difficult, that it was just, to be able to, for hours on end, to just contemplate, how sad I was for that kid, how sad I was for myself and not understanding why I was in that position, that it was just, it was just really horrible. And essentially it would be me, you can go ahead and take it down now. It would just be me. Essentially, I would go back to that cell like every time, but essentially in between times, it would be like being pulled out to essentially be like raped in different ways. It's like each time there was like a different kind of like theme to it. It would be being taken to like another room that was really similar, but a little bit bigger, that had like a metal table on it. And like, it would be, tied spread eagle essentially, and having like, initially it was being raped by a machine. So you had this sensation being raped, but you couldn't see anything. So it was being told that it was like demons essentially, and that, like next time it was going to be worse and stuff. So then you go, back to the cage after that shit, and it's like, so it's the dealing with like the, pain of that kind of stuff, in addition, and I also had like, the rape memory with my dad had not happened yet. So it's like, so this was also my first experience with actually being fully vaginally raped as well, was it'd always been like, fingers before, so something like more drastic. This was like the first time that had been the case, and then you go back to that room essentially, and then you're like, they pull you out later, and then you're back in, the rape room, I guess I'll call it, which is essentially a spot, and this time it's someone dressed as Lucifer, basically a devil, big horns and shit like that, and they're the ones that's like raping you essentially. And then it's back into the cell,